With the recent developments in Eastern Europe, it seems that a part of the Russian army indulges itself in murder, pillage, and even assault in the territories they've conquered. When talking about the Russian or Soviet soldier from a historical perspective, some people noted that, I quote, "the Russian soldier has not changed a bit." And this triggered me to dive into the history of the Russian or Soviet soldier in World War I and World War II. Did they always behave savagely to the people they've conquered? That is what you will learn today. Good to have you back on the channel. If you're new, my name is Stefan. I'm a Dutch history teacher and I make videos about history for you. If you find it interesting, please consider subscribing and also hit that notification bell. In this video, we're going to take a look at different moments in both the First and the Second World War, where the Russian or Soviet army occupied territories that belonged to other nations previously, and how civilians were treated by the Russian or Soviet soldier at that time. The goal of this episode is to draw similarities, but more important, spot the differences, since history refuses simplicity. Second, we need to distinguish the behavior of the soldier stationed in the area versus the measure taken by the Russian or Soviet government. Sometimes they intertwine, sometimes they differ. Let's take a look at Russia during the First World War. When the First World War broke out, Russia did not enter the conflict against Germany from a position of strength. Russia did have an advantage over Germany when it came down to manpower and resources. However, these were not exploited to the fullest. Political instability and unrealized industrial and military potential could cripple the country in times of war. The first hostilities on the World War I Eastern Front took place at the German town of Stallupönen in East Prussia, which was invaded by the Russian army. And on the 20th of August, the Russians achieved a victory at the Battle of Gumbinnen. Later, Rastenburg, located in the very center of Germany's easternmost province, fell, and the capital Königsberg might have been next, but it never got that far. During the Battle of Tannenberg, the Russian Second Army was annihilated. The Russian First Army was defeated at the Masurian Lakes, after which the Russians were kicked out of East Prussia. So how did the Russian soldier behave during their short-lived occupation of East Prussia? According to historian Laura Engelstein, the Russian army invaded East Prussia with the intent of uprooting its inhabitants. Many Germans that lived inside the borders of the Russian Empire were deported to the Russian interior, out of fear that they could spread information to the enemy or, in case of adult males, join the German army. In their blindness and anxiety, Russian soldiers viewed the inhabitants as potential spies. They express rather a general atmosphere of paranoia, enhanced with the feelings of inadequacy in the face of the formidable German war machine, and sustained by the xenophobic ideology of the radical right, whose influence was felt in the highest places. Areas of East Prussia were occupied by the Russian Imperial Army twice, in August 1914 and again in October 1914 to February 1915. Upon returning, Germans found villages had been looted by both sides and left in ruins. Russian commanders instructed their troops that once they were fired at by German civilians, to confiscate any property of military value and then burn the place down. Women and children were allowed to depart, but in practice, troops were never that careful. In the case of East Prussia, the Russian forces engaged in a widespread rape of women and girls, mistreatment of prisoners of war, and the wanton destruction of property, all of which the German Foreign Office officially denounced as violations of the Geneva and Hague Conventions on the Laws of War. I do have to mention that the earlier mentioned atmosphere of paranoia also manifested itself among German soldiers, which eventually resulted in the destruction of Calais and German atrocities in Belgium. The Russian occupation of Eastern Galicia lasted longer, from August 1914 till June 1915. During the Battle of Galicia, the Russian army achieved a breakthrough against the Austro-Hungarians. When the Russians took control over Eastern Galicia, Russian nationalists in the Duma claimed this territory was original part of Russian lands and urged annexation. Yet the Russians were in a minority in this area, since there were many people of Greek, Polish and Jewish descent living here as well. The Jews from the get-go were mistrusted and viewed as a transnational fifth column. The Russian army had various reasons to distrust the non-Slavic population across the border, but its reactions were conditioned not only by the murky reality of warfare on foreign soil. They were shaped also by official policies towards the Jews at home and by the anti-Semitic attitudes that prevailed even in educated circles and completely dominated at court. The administrators of occupied Galicia were committed to anti-Semitism as a political ideology and a guide to official policy. In the early days of Russian occupation, soldiers destroyed the Jewish quarter in Brody. Late September, a similar pogrom took place in Lemberg, all because of, allegedly, Jewish aggression against Russian troops. Not only Jews were targeted, but also Ukrainians. Leaders of the Ukrainian Uniate Church, among other notable Ukrainians, were deported to Siberia. The mass deportations did raise objections among Russian notables, who believed it would lead to congestion in the interior. As Russian General Alexeyev complained in March 1915 with regard to the eastward expulsion of Galician Jews, "This is unacceptable. We already have too many of them." In April 1915, when winter was over, the Germans attacked at the southern point of the Eastern Front and launched the Garlis-Tarnów offensive, and together with the Austro-Hungarians achieved a major breakthrough, in which they took back the Russian gains of Galicia and also made over 140,000 prisoners. By June, Przemysl and Lemberg were retaken. Later that summer, the Germans managed to seize Warsaw, Brest-Litovsk. The Russians then commenced to the Great Retreat, in which they relinquished an area of more than 100,000 square miles. Another huge morale blow. This eventually would fuel the resentment that would cause the Russian Revolution of 1917. But that topic is beyond the scope of this video. However, I did cover this elaborate in other videos on this channel. Let's jump to the Second World War. When we speak of the Red Army advancing through Eastern Europe, we think of the period of 1944-45. But in 1939, this was also the case, because on September 17th, the Red Army invaded Eastern Poland. A month earlier, Joseph Stalin had signed a non-aggression pact with Hitler, the so-called MOLOTOV-RIBBENTROP pact, where also spheres of influence were decided, read occupation. The Soviet invasion of Eastern Poland happened swift. Poland's eastern borders weren't that well protected, and the main Polish army was crumbling under the German onslaught, which started on the 1st of September. Stalin ordered his troops to move in on September 17th. The excuse the Soviets used was that they wanted to protect non-Polish people in the region. Now, this excuse was obviously nonsense, but what is true is that Eastern Poland was inhabited by many non-Polish people, such as Ukrainians, Belarusians, and Jews. To prevent breaches of the law, the army had issued the soldiers involved in the occupation with a small allowance in cash. But there was just too much to spend it on. If the locals would not sell their goods for kopecks, the troops used threats to get the things they saw. They plundered simple cottages in search of loot. Nonetheless, regular Red Army men were relatively benign as an occupation force. Although the Red Army soldiers generally behaved correct, political agitators that followed in their wake certainly did not. Soviet agitators urged peasants to take revenge on landlords. Though most people resisted the call to criminality, chaos reigned as thousands did not. Mass murders with axes were suddenly frequent. In some cases, individual Red Army soldiers joined the fray, but not often. The NKVD brought in notorious thugs that arrested and tortured many people. A total of 190,400 were arrested, of which 8,513 were executed. In the spring of 1940, 22,000 members of the Polish intelligentsia and military were executed by the NKVD on Stalin's orders, collectively known as the Captain Massacre. Many people were deported to Siberia and Kazakhstan and would not survive. From the beginning of the Second World War, we're going to switch our focus to the end. In the autumn of 1944, the Red Army got a foothold on German soil, East Prussia again. The German village of Nemmersdorf suffered a great ordeal, which was discovered after it was retaken by the Germans, where they found 20 inhabitants murdered and all houses destroyed. This continued after the Soviets overran the province. Women and girls were raped by the masses, often in front of horrified family members. German inhabitants that weren't able to flee the Red Army were simply shot on the spot. Men, women, children, and the elderly. And buildings were set on fire. Whole East Prussian settlements, towns and cities were burned down. Why was the Red Army so cruel to the German civilians? Well, for everyone that knows a little bit of history, I think you can imagine a reason. Revenge. Many Red Army soldiers had not one but multiple family members that had perished during the war. Those soldiers whose families lived under German occupation in some cases never saw their family members again. And furthermore, as the Soviets retook Ukraine, they witnessed the massive death and destruction the Germans had caused. The hatred against Germans was also fueled by Soviet propaganda. Ilya Ehrenberg, who was a writer for the Soviet newspaper Red Star, often aped Nazi language and twisted it around the theme of "Kill the Germans." Furthermore, once Red Army soldiers entered Germany in East Prussia, they were amazed by the luxurious lifestyle these people enjoyed, especially compared to their lifestyle, which made them ask themselves, if the Germans had so much, why did they attack us who have so little? And lastly, Stalin did not intervene. Although rape was a crime in the Red Army, Stalin had condoned it. Stalin said people should understand it if a soldier who has crossed thousands of kilometers through blood and fire and death has fun with a woman or takes some thrill. On another occasion, he seemed to have said, "We lecture our soldiers too much. Let them have their initiative." These brutalities were carried out all the way to Berlin, although the cruelty in East Prussia outmatched the cruelty in Berlin regarding the killing of civilians. Nevertheless, rapes continued for years after the armistice in the Soviet-controlled territories of Germany. A reason for Stalin to allow his troops to have some fun with women was also that he feared his troops might turn against him once they witnessed the luxurious lifestyle the Germans had. These two emotions, resentment and revenge, were now mingled in an explosive brew. As Soviet troops scrambled to send packages filled with German goods home, plundering everything in their path, they also began exacting an understandable, if no less brutal, vengeance. But it would be wrong to state that the Soviet Red Army only committed crimes against German civilians. The country of Hungary suffered a similar ordeal. Hungary sided with the Axis in 1940 and joined Hitler's attack on the USSR. In 1943, the Hungarians suffered an enormous defeat at the Don. From that moment, Hungarian government leaders wanted to exit the war. Secret talks with the Allies resulted in the Germans moving into the country in March 1944. Hungarian regent Miklos Horthy continued to contact the Allies and managed an armistice with the Soviets, who by that time, October 1944, were well within Hungary's borders. Now the Nazis removed Horthy from power and replaced him by a puppet leader, Ferenc Szálasi, who led the fascist Arrow Cross Party. Hungary would go down fighting as the capital Budapest was laid under siege from December 1944 till February 1945. Only some 700 out of the around 44,000 German-Hungarian troops managed to escape. Around 76,000 civilians died in the siege, most of them due to starvation. The battle would leave the majority of Budapest in ruins. 80% of the city was destroyed. Many Hungarian inhabitants were deported by the Soviets, and many Hungarian women and girls were raped by the Red Army troops. There were other countries that were allied with Nazi Germany as well and came under the Soviet sphere of influence after the war: Romania and Bulgaria. But these countries managed to switch sides successfully, so it wouldn't make much sense if you start killing the inhabitants of a country that has now become your ally. Besides, Bulgaria never committed its troops to the Eastern Front. Irate violence against women, however, did occur. Also in Yugoslavia, which for the majority was liberated by the Yugoslav partisans, but Red Army troops did cover some ground. Also there, local women were assaulted, after which Yugoslav politicians complained. Historian Norman Naimark noted the fact that tendency to binge drink alcohol, of which much was available in Germany, had on the propensity of Soviet soldiers to commit these assaults combined with murder. Naimark also points out the allegedly patriarchal nature of Russian society as well as Asian societies within the Soviet Union. It came down to Soviet military leaders not intervening. If the Red Army commanders did implement the same harsh measures of discipline on assaulting women, it most likely would have occurred much less. Sometimes intervention did take place, but this was rare. Soviet Marshal Rokossovsky issued Order Number 006 in an attempt to direct the feelings of hatred at fighting the enemy on the battlefield. It appears to have had little effect. There were also a few arbitrary attempts to exert authority. The commander of one rifle division is said to have personally shot a lieutenant who was lining up a group of his men before a German woman spread-eagled on the ground. But either officers were involved themselves, or the lack of discipline made it too dangerous to restore order over drunken soldiers armed with submachine guns. Much due to the brutality of war Red Army troops had been through, assaults on women occurred widespread, no matter these women were German, Hungarian, Yugoslav or Polish. Because when you compare this to the Soviet invasion of Poland 1939, many troops had not seen war brutalities apart from some at Khelkin Gol. So therefore attacks on local civilians occurred much less, only when political agitators make their move. Can you say that the Russian soldier is savage by nature? No. The Russian soldier, like any other soldier, is shaped by circumstances, government policies, as well as how troops fare on the ground. The combination of hardships and lawlessness makes terror against non-combatants unavoidable. In its history, the Russian and Soviet soldiers have been exposed to much hardships. And on top of that, the Russian or Soviet government in both cases was a government of autocracy. And autocratic governments mostly don't care about the welfare of their own citizens, let alone the welfare of foreign citizens. For this video I did several case studies, but there are other interesting cases as well. What about the Russian armies against the Ottoman Empire in times of war? What about the Soviet armies in Manchuria in 1945? Or what about the Soviet-Afghan War or the Chechen War? And can we link this to the current situation in Ukraine? If you have any interesting insights you want to share, feel free to do so below the video. Please support me if you can, so I can make better, cooler and more awesome content for you. If you like to learn the details about the Soviet occupation of Eastern Poland 39-41, you can click right here. And I did make an episode on location about Soviet brutality in East Prussia. Click right here. Give this video a like. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you later.